A married businessman who ran away with his teenage employee, a powerful film executive who started a relationship with one of Titanic's most famous survivors, and a woman who interrupted the Titanic inquiries, crying over a woman who wasn't her husband. These are all real stories connected to Titanic, and if you've ever thought that your love life is messy, I promise you, history has a story that's messier. I'm Kaylee, and today we're deep diving into some of the most dramatic relationships on board Titanic, because as it turns out, the ship of dreams carried a lot more baggage than anyone realized. Let's start with a man who didn't just have an affair, he tried to disappear with the other woman. If someone's ever told you that they needed space in a relationship, I can almost guarantee they weren't talking about what Henry Samuel Morley did in 1912. Henry Morley was born into modest means in 1873, coming from a family of tailors. He worked in a grocery store growing up, working his way to manager, and eventually being able to afford his own confectionery businesses. He met and married his first wife, Louisa, in 1899, and the couple had one daughter in 1903 they named Doris. So far, it seems like a real underdog story, building themselves up from nothing and becoming a wealthy family. However, everything would change when Henry met his 19-year-old shop assistant, Kate Florence Phillip. Henry, now 38, fell head over heels for Kate, and it seems like she did the same for him. The couple decided that they wanted to establish a new life together. So instead of getting a divorce, as you might think, remember, divorce during this time was heavily stigmatized and hard to get. They decided to start a new life instead. Henry buys second-class tickets on Titanic under the fake names of Mr. and Mrs. Marshall, and his brother even sees them off at Southampton. Read this article and decide for yourself if you think that he knew. I think he probably knew what was going on, but that's just my biased opinion. The newlyweds board Titanic as a honeymooning couple, and for a few short days, they enjoy the privilege of being able to be open with their love. They talk about their plans to establish a new life in California, where Henry would open up another confectionery business and they would start their new lives together. It's even reported that while on board, Henry gave Kate a beautiful sapphire necklace, which may have been the inspiration for the Heart of the Ocean that you have seen in the Titanic movie. As we know, history intervenes in the form of an iceberg on April 14th, 1912. Kate narrowly survives, but Henry is among the many second-class men who are lost that night. All their dreams came crashing back to reality, and suddenly Kate had to go through life without the man that she loved and starting a new life in a new country. Although she soon discovered that she wasn't so alone, as just a few months after staying in New York, she discovered that she was pregnant with Henry's child. This sparks Kate to return home to have the baby, and on January 11th, 1913, baby Ellen is born, exactly 9 months to the day that Titanic set sail. The trauma from Titanic left lasting scars on Kate, and her daughter Ellen was left to be raised by her grandparents for the first 10 years of her life. Kate continued on to London, where she became a hat and shoe saleswoman. She eventually remarried to a man named Frederick and regained custody of Ellen when she was about 10 years old, around 1922. While I was reading one of the letters that Ellen wrote, she talked about how there was this woman who would come about once a year and shower her with love and affection and then leave. And then when she was about 10 years old, her mom got custody of her and she learned that that stranger who would come over and shower her in affection was actually her mother. Ellen learned that her father was Henry Morley from Titanic, but Kate never wanted to talk about it. Ellen wrote about the relationship she had with her mother Kate and alleged that it became abusive, with authorities having to step in on at least one occasion. Kate's mental health really suffered after Titanic, and she eventually spent time in an asylum before passing away bedridden in 1964. Ellen and her were so estranged that Ellen didn't learn of her mother's passing until months after the funeral. Ellen spent her entire life trying to understand who she was and prove that she was the daughter of Henry Samuel Morley. And eventually in 2020, DNA evidence was able to prove that conclusively. However, she did not live long enough to see that happen. I think what makes Kate and Henry's story so fascinating is that on the surface, it just feels like a regular affair story, but the more I dug into it, I realized it's a story about consequences. The choices that these individuals made didn't just affect them and those around them, but it trickled down for generations after that. For me, that's what makes this story unforgettable. Not the scandal, not the shipwreck, but the fact that the choices we make can echo long after we're gone. And speaking of men who were traveling with their mistresses, Henry certainly wasn't the only one doing that. In the higher echelons of society, infidelity was treated a little differently. While on paper, Morley and Benjamin Guggenheim seem similar, Benjamin Guggenheim wasn't exactly trying to hide his mistress. When most people hear the name Benjamin Guggenheim, they think of one of Titanic's most famous passengers, the millionaire gentleman who reportedly dressed in his best and was prepared to go down as a gentleman. And yes, this is all likely true and a huge part of his legacy, but Ben was also human, and humans are complicated. While Ben was on board Titanic making history, his wife was at home, and traveling with him on the voyage was another woman entirely. But wait, before we clutch our pearls, it's worth understanding that Upper Edwardian society operated by a different set of rules. The strangest thing wasn't that Ben had a mistress. It was how many people may have already known about it. Benjamin was born into the wealthy Guggenheim family, who had made their fortunes in the mining industry. He married Fleurette in 1894, and the couple had 3 daughters. Alongside J.J. Astor, Ben was one of the richest men on Titanic. Funny enough, despite being a quote-unquote rich girl, Fleurette had a reputation for being very frugal with her money. It was known around social circles that she wouldn't tip very well and had a tendency to underpay her service workers. That's not related to the affair, but it's an interesting quality to look at. Benjamin often lived separate from his family, maintaining a home in Paris while he was away. Ben and Fleurette's marriage seemed to be one of uniting wealth and power rather than love, which also wasn't very uncommon in the ultra-wealthy. Enter Léontine Aubart, a 24-year-old singer from Paris, and she definitely caught Benjamin's eye despite being about 20 years younger than him. She was the one who was traveling with Titanic alongside him. In fact, their accommodations were just across the hall from each other. This wasn't exactly an arrangement where they were trying to hide their relationship. The real question we want to ask here is, did Mrs. Guggenheim know? And while we don't have definitive evidence to prove either way, it's likely that she did. Arrangements like this, because they were not uncommon, they also were not unknown. When I think about Ben and his mistress, I think of The Great Gatsby, where remember how Tom Buchanan had that mistress that everyone kind of knew about, it just wasn't spoken within the family, but she was still calling his house and Daisy very obviously knew. At the end of the day, public image mattered more than private happiness. During the sinking, Benjamin reportedly helps women into lifeboats and takes off his life vest and puts on his evening wear and says, "We are dressed in our best and prepared to go down as gentlemen." And indeed he does. He is one of the many who are lost on Titanic, and Léontine is left without her lover. In correspondence, she was writing back to say that she was saved, but Ben was lost. When Léontine decides to return to France, she's so razzled by the experience that in her haste or nervousness, she left her tickets that were supposed to take her from Paris to her next destination back at her lodgings. Léontine lived through the 1920s and reportedly hosted lavish parties, sometimes so extravagant that they drew the attention of local police and had to be shut down. She later married in 1927 and lived to an old age. She was reportedly a very nice and sweet old lady who loved children, but no one believed her when she talked about traveling on Titanic with her wealthy lover. That is until after her passing in 1964, when articles about her and the Titanic were found within her personal belongings. This story reminds me that historic actions and personal drama can coexist together, and just because somebody makes some questionable decisions with their mistress does not mean that they lack integrity in some ways either. Historical figures don't fit in neat categories, and I think we can remember Benjamin Guggenheim as both a gentleman and someone with some questionable morals in his love life. Humans are very complicated, as we're finding out. Just like our next couple. At least Benjamin Guggenheim wasn't pretending that his relationship was just professional. If you've ever been privy to a workplace romance, just know that this has been going on since 1912. Meet Dorothy Gibson and Jules Brulatour. Dorothy had quite the long list of accolades by the time she boarded Titanic at just 22 years old. She had worked as a singer between 1907 to 1911 and posed as a model for Harrison Fisher. Think the famous Gibson Girl. She was also stepping into the role of leading lady for the rising film studio Eclair Films. You could find Dorothy's face everywhere in Edwardian pop culture. Now, of course, behind the scenes was a film executive pulling the strings. Jules Brulatour was a powerful film executive who would later go on to be a co-founder of Universal Studios. He was already married with 3 children, but took quite a liking to Dorothy, and as we've already discussed, mistresses weren't exactly uncommon. It's unclear when their professional relationship crossed the boundaries into a romantic one, but gossip circled them for years. When Dorothy boarded Titanic, she was on a European vacation with her mother after completing a set of successful films for Eclair Studios. It was the telegram from Jules telling her that he had more new opportunities for her back in the States that prompted her and her mother to board Titanic and return home. Dorothy and her mother boarded Titanic as first-class passengers, and they survived the sinking in the first lifeboat to leave the ship. But Dorothy's life only gets more complicated from here. Jules is one of the first people that Dorothy contacts post-disaster, and within days, he's already thinking of opportunities to turn this into something more positive. By the time Carpathia docks in New York just a few days later, Jules had organized specific cameramen to go and capture the moment of survivors coming in. He took previous clips of Titanic's Captain Smith on board Olympic, as well as this new footage, and created a newsreel that aired on April 22nd. Then, possibly motivated by the success of this newsreel, Jules and Dorothy went to work creating the first dramatization of the event since the sinking. Saved from the Titanic became the first dramatization of the event, and it aired only 31 days after the sinking. In the silent film, Dorothy portrays herself and even wears the same outfit that she was saved in the night the Titanic sank. And while the audience was fascinated with the production, the experience seemed to take its toll on Dorothy's mental health. Ironically, despite it being the first film about Titanic and one of the most popular films to air, nobody can see it today, and it's considered a lost film. In 1914, just a few years later, a fire destroyed the Eclair studios and burned down every copy that was known to exist. Today, only advertisements, photographs, and newspaper clippings remain, and in many ways, the film disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived. Dorothy and Jules kept their affair hush-hush until it was impossible for headlines to look away. In 1913, Dorothy was involved in a fatal car crash, and contemporary reports say that she was driving Brulatour's car when she struck and killed a pedestrian. A civil lawsuit followed, and the affair that had been whispered about for years was now public headlines. The scandal contributed to the collapse of Jules' first marriage, and it prompted him to get divorced in 1915. Then, 2 years later, he and Dorothy wed in 1917. After all the gossip, headlines, and whispers, it seemed like the couple finally got what they always wanted. Or so it seemed, because their marriage lasted less than 3 years. For nearly a decade, people speculated about the relationship between Dorothy and Jules, and once it finally came to fruition, it seemed to fizzle out just as quickly as it started. This next story is a little bit harder to explain, because while historians debate when the relationship between Dorothy and Jules started, we can know definitively that they at least knew each other and they did get married. The same can't be said for the woman in this next story. In fact, the next one still remains a mystery. Immediately following Titanic's sinking, confusing reports and misinformation hit the headlines, with no one really knowing just how bad the devastation was. Some newspapers even reported that no one had died at all. That's the foggy atmosphere that people were navigating through in 1912. The US began their inquiries into the disaster almost as soon as Carpathia docked in New York and survivors were offboarding. On the second day of testimony, a very peculiar incident happened. While wireless operator Harold Bride was on the stand, a mysterious woman barged into the room, crying and pleading, asking if anyone had known the fate of First Officer William Murdoch. Those around her either weren't sure or didn't have the nerve to tell her that he did not survive, and eventually her cries grew louder until the chairman asked Mr. Lightoller to take her to the side and tell her whatever she wished to know. This woman was incredibly moved by Murdoch's death, but it's still unclear who she was to him. People have speculated who this mystery woman could have been, often citing a letter that Murdoch had written to a Miss Nancy a few years prior. The letter in itself is interesting because, in addition to not having a last name, only being addressed to a Miss Nancy, the date on the letter is also unclear. It appears like it could have been written in 1907 or 1909, and depending on when it was written, is a big clue to who this woman might have been. You see, Murdoch was married in 1909, but he wasn't married in 1907. So if he wrote this letter in 1907, could it have been a previous suitor or somebody he was interested in? Or if it was written in 1909, perhaps it could have been a family friend, or who knows? The letter in itself is very cordial and not flirty in nature. So naturally, people have speculated if this letter that Murdoch wrote to a Miss Nancy could have been to a Miss Nancy Harding. Personally, I think it's a bit of a stretch. With letters being the primary form of communication, it seems a little bit too easy for one of the only surviving letters we have of Murdoch's to be connected to this woman who barged in looking for him. I don't feel like there's enough compelling evidence to say that this letter is connected to her, but it's also not impossible. What do you think? Maybe that's why the weeping woman continues to fascinate us to this day. Most relationship stories end with answers. This one begins and ends with a question. Who was she? A secret lover, a close friend, or perhaps a passenger who was moved by something Murdoch had done in the sinking? The truth is, we don't know. After spending all this time researching relationships connected to Titanic, I've realized something. The affairs, the scandals, the secrets, those are all stories that grab our attention, but it's the unanswered questions that keep us coming back. Henry Morley left behind a daughter who spent her life searching for answers. Benjamin Guggenheim left behind a reputation that was far more complicated than anyone realized. Dorothy Gibson and Jules Brulatour spent years navigating rumors, headlines, and public scrutiny just for their marriage to fizzle out in a couple years. And the Weeping Woman left behind nothing but a mystery for us. Titanic is a story about humanity and the stories that everyday people carry with them. The longer I study it, the more I find myself drawn to the people, their relationships, their choices and mistakes, and especially the unanswered questions they left behind. Are there any other Titanic stories you want to hear about next? Drop them in the comments, and thanks for watching.